In amongst the Halo 2 levels I love are scattered several I think are a bit iffy, but none bore me to quite the same degree that Sacred Icon does. Grey, tedious and unexciting, it is the worst mission in the game's campaign. Sacred Icon starts out strong thanks to Bungie's terrific storytelling. Elite Commander Artas Fadum strongly protests the Prophet's decision to relieve the elites of their honour duties and replace them with brutes, but it's all in vain as he is rebuked harshly for his efforts.
The Hierarch is dead, Commander.
His murderer was within our grasp. If you had not withdrawn our phantoms...
Are you questioning my decision?
No, Holy One. I only wish to express my concern that the brutes...
Recommissioning the Guard was a radical step. But recent events have made it abundantly clear that the elites can no longer guarantee our safety.
The Arbiter, on the other hand, still serves some use, and as such, they speak to him almost as if he's part of the Prophet's inner circle.
Politics, how tiresome. Do you know, Arbiter, the elites have threatened to resign, to quit the High Council, because of this exchange of hats?
We have always been your protectors.
These are trying times for all of us.
It's a great demonstration of how expertly the Covenant's leaders are able to change tack at a moment's notice to manipulate those they need something from, and indeed those that they don't. The Arbiter is then given his next task, to retrieve an activation index, also known as a Sacred Icon, hence the mission's name, which is needed to activate the newly discovered Delta Halo. If it's an objective that feels familiar, that's because it is. During Halo Combat Evolved, you also had to secure an activation index under false pretenses. Bungie plays with the idea of similar but different constantly during Halo 2. Master Chief and the Arbiter are in their own ways both responsible for the destruction of Installation 04, the former for making it happen and the latter for failing to prevent it from happening, with Chief being praised and the Arbiter being punished as a result. Here the Arbiter is sent to search for the index for religious reasons, while in Halo, Master Chief's approach was a pragmatic one. He did what he did to halt the spread of the Flood. And there are plenty more besides. Bungie drawing so many comparisons between the two makes understanding and empathising with the Arbiter easier than it would be otherwise, as his story is for all intents and purposes similar but different. A Bungie staple throughout the Halo series is their attention to geography and their desire to imbue worlds with scale that makes sense, and this is evident immediately from the off during Sacred Icon. You can catch sight of the Sentinel wall you have to fight your way through, the lands beyond it traversed during following level Quarantine Zone, as well as the library itself, your final destination. The Phantom depicted also flies backwards during the Anniversary Edition cinematic for just that one short scene. It only lasts 3 or 4 seconds though, so I'd wager the majority won't even realise. There's more landmarks to spot when you take control of the Arbiter as well. If you turn around, you can see the lakes where earlier Master Chief had assassinated the Prophet of Regret, while in the sky above looms High Charity, which you'll also explore as Chief. Expectation is, of course, that Halo 2's protagonists will soon meet, and these glimpses of the wider landscape and their proximity to each other subtly hints that will happen sooner rather than later. For the observant, there is some very mild environmental storytelling during these opening minutes. Dead Sentinels and Covenant litter the area, and constructors mill about attempting to repair any damage the facility has sustained. There's also a grunt cowering in the corner, surrounded by what looks like Flood biomatter, hinting at what's to come. I wouldn't exactly describe it as the most thrilling example in the series, but it does set the tone, I suppose. These vents are fun. As you jump in and begin your fall, unsettling music briefly swells to make it feel like you're descending into a situation not altogether pleasant, one you are now unable to escape. Then you arrive at another floor, and there's absolutely no follow-up, save a dead grunt and a piston you have to activate to continue on. Vents are good, pistons are bad. I find it rather irritating to have to keep faffing around with them, and they're just another of the mission's repetitive aspects, along with its aesthetic, architecture, enemies and combat, most of it honestly. A small corridor or two is used to introduce you to the concept of respawning Sentinels while there's little else to distract. You can kill as many as you want, but unless you destroy the source they'll keep coming, with audio cues guiding you to where they are being manufactured. There are multiple encounters further forward during which you have to deal with a seemingly endless stream of Sentinels while also being harassed by hordes of Flood, and not knowing why they keep coming or how to stop it happening would be extraordinarily frustrating. Here then you're presented with a learning opportunity so you don't end up getting too overwhelmed later on. As you continue to deal with the Sentinels across the 2 larger rooms which followed, you're joined, albeit temporarily, by a few Jackals for the first and only time not only in Halo 2, but in the entire series. Considering how uninspired a lot of what happens around them is, it's difficult to get particularly excited, which is a real shame. Working in tandem with them, using them almost as mobile cover when they have their shields up, would have made for some unique gameplay. This grunt is clearly even less enamoured with their presence than I am.
Arbiter, our savior! Stupid jackal, say thank you.
Covenant allies in tow, you meet the first of Sacred Icon's Sentinel enforcers after, an enemy type I think of as recurring mini-bosses. There's a nice touch right off the bat with a carbine placed deliberately ahead of you when entering the room, so no matter what weapons you're carrying or how much ammo they have remaining, you always have the option to begin the fight with something capable of damaging your giant robo-adversary from range. If you choose to fight it, it's an entertaining enough challenge, as it's one of the few enemies most effectively tackled from behind, like hunters. You can choose to ignore it entirely too. If you run rings around the Enforcer while deactivating all 4 plug locks and then power down the containment shield, it will have a bit of a melty and explode without you ever needing to fire a single shot. Next up, a slow-moving platform you're forced to sit on while the shield you've deactivated retracts overhead, an admittedly gorgeous visual. Like every other time slow-moving platforms rear their ugly heads during Halo 2, however, this one adds nothing much to what has already been a dull, glacially paced affair. Sure, it also gives you a better view of the vast structure you spend your time in, and it does get more action-packed towards the back end of the ride as enemies start to appear, but there is a good 35 seconds prior during which you basically just stand still and look around a bit, which isn't at all ideal. It does allow time for the Arbiter and Tartarus's uneasy working relationship to continue being built out. And bearing in mind what happens at the end of Quarantine Zone later, it's important Tartarus keeps popping up throughout the level as it lends more weight to his eventual betrayal. That's about as good as Sacred Icon's storytelling gets though, with little else to write home about from a narrative perspective. The Flood are now a real threat in addition to regular Sentinels and Enforcers, and your first encounter back on non-slow moving ground involves all 3. While it plays out, something worth noting here, a long time passes without any proper music being played from this point onwards. All that can really be heard most of the time is the Flood, Sentinels, occasional Marines, and the sounds of the facility itself, which all help make Sacred Icon's atmosphere imposing. At the same time, it doesn't exactly help with its issue of it not being very memorable. Many of my fondest Halo memories are intertwined with the soundtrack which accompanies them, and other than when in events, I can't single out any part of this level which has close to a similar effect. You'll be dealing with the Flood very frequently indeed as you continue on your merry way. I like that during this portion of the game, Bungie goes to great lengths to highlight that no faction is having an easy time dealing with them. You constantly run the risk of being swamped, the Sentinels are struggling, and you'll likely spot a squad of Marines being overrun in the distance.
Proceed to the objective. We'll hold out as long as we can. Get her off me! Suppressive fire! Suppressive fire!
The bodies of soldiers also litter the areas which follow, and I believe I'm right in saying that most, if not all, of the combat forms encountered have been created using human bodies, showing just how devastating a loss they in particular have endured. Fighting some humans as the Arbiter here would have been the dream, but I'm not going to dwell on that much for the time being, as I'll return to the idea during my video covering Quarantine Zone. What I will say is that where that mission at least had a hook, it being predominantly vehicle based and including Flood driving vehicles for the first and only time in the series, Sacred Icon lacks any defining feature. Fighting Marines on foot in amongst the Flood and Sentinels would have really helped it stand out. The majority of combat you do get involved in is fairly run-of-the-mill, and during Halo 2 I'd have liked to have seen the Flood in more natural environments, as opposed to only the industrial hellscapes they so often inhabit throughout the series. And staying on those environments for just a second, it's also surprising how little verticality they have too. Even some of Bungie's worst attempts give you plenty of opportunities to take advantage of different levels within arenas, but in Sacred Icon everything is generally very flat. it's all a bit lazy. Is it as deeply lacking in variety as, say, Halo Combat Evolved's The Library or Halo 3's Cortana, the worst missions in their respective games? No, it's definitely not, as the multiple factions involved do help keep things varied. But where The Library and Cortana oftentimes felt annoying, Sacred Icon feels uninspired, and that's arguably worse. If the Flood had not been unnecessarily introduced during earlier Mission the Oracle, it would have a niche to call its own, but because you've already encountered them in fairly similar circumstances, events feel like a repeat of sorts. After a few more skirmishes, things open up a little more with another Enforcer, Sentinels and Flood all thrown into one encounter, which I actually really like, as it's a natural progression from those earlier. Over the course of one level, combat develops from you fighting a single Enforcer in a large room while using distractions, or skipping it entirely if you know how, to fighting an Enforcer and Sentinels while also having to deal with the Flood. Then you have to repeat that, except the Enforcer keeps its distance, making it significantly harder to manage in amongst everything else, fighting smaller enemies generally engaged at short range at the same time as a massive enemy that can only be engaged at long range makes for an entertaining mix. During its latter stages, Sacred Icon threatens to do something interesting, with new areas introduced which have been flood infested for a longer period, where it's difficult to see through the thick green smog enveloping you. The panicked cries of Marines ring out in the background too, further adding to the tension.
Negative, ma'am. They are not Covenant. Cover that doorway!
It's a nice change of atmosphere compared to the floors above, and for a short while it helps make combat feel fresh again. The reduced visibility is a great idea in principle, and I'm fairly certain it's the first time in the series you experience an environment like it, but don't quote me on that. However, since you are still only fighting Flood and Sentinels and you've been doing that for a long time already, these battles also begin to wear thin, and I've personally never found them particularly fun to begin with. What I like a lot more is that when you drop down another level directly after escaping the smoggy, flood-filled corridors, you get your best view of the library so far. Seconds earlier, you could barely see 5 feet ahead of you, and now you're able to gaze upon the Forerunner's architecture in all its glory. That juxtaposition really helps the enormous building leave a lasting impression. There is a second scary vent you have to drop down as well. After falling while frightening music played but discovering nothing of note at the bottom near Sacred Icon's beginning, you'll likely expect the same again. Instead, this time there is a whole lot of conflict waiting for you, with the music continuing on into the encounter itself. Given there's only a single, less action-packed vent, claiming Bungie has conditioned you to expect nothing this time is perhaps a step too far, but the rug is definitely pulled out from under you regardless. After a trip down Sacred Icon's third and final vent, there's one last section out on the installation's tundra to get through. As it begins, you can watch a Sentinel manufacturing facility being blasted out of the sky, and you'll soon have to navigate its wreckage around Quarantine Zone's midpoint. It's another excellent example of Bungie's commitment to environmental consistency. Bungie also continues the Halo tradition of empowering you at the end of flood-heavy missions by giving you some backup. It happens at the end of 343 Guilty Spark in Combat Evolved twice, once with Marines and soon after again with Sentinels. It happens in Halo 3's Floodgate with the arrival of a squad of elites, and a second time a few missions later when the Arbiter turns up at the end of Cortana. It happens in Sacred Icon with its own squad of elites lending a hand. Even Quarantine Zone immediately after features it too, with more elites joining the Arbiter for the umpteenth ride on a slow-moving platform. They serve as a morale boost at the end of what are always draining sections. The Flood isn't necessarily the hardest enemy to take down, but their repetitive nature can become exhausting after prolonged periods spent fighting them, and moments like these let you cut loose, taking some of the edge off, especially with Artas and company backing you up as you hold off a few final waves of Flood. One thing I will say is that I absolutely love the screaming sound as they make their presence known. I always find it incredibly unsettling.
Arbiter, what are you doing here? Let's hold this camp until reinforcements.
Then, once all these screaming monsters have been cleared, like so many of Halo 2's multi-part levels, Sacred Icon abruptly ends with zero fanfare whatsoever. When I first made a video about this level many moons ago, I argued that while it's bad, it's a definite step up from some of Bungie's biggest stinkers, such as the Library in Combat Evolved and Cortana in 3. In the present, I hold a different view. For all the dreck you have to soldier through during those two, they at least had intriguing concepts and carried meaning in story terms, putting its opening cinematic to one side, and those scenes are fairly disconnected from everything else anyway. Sacred Icon has neither. After Regret's cliffhanger, which left Master Chief's fate unclear, Halo 2 should have begun building up narrative pace as the campaign reached its second half. Instead, we get a bland, deeply uninteresting experience which goes on far longer than it should, considering how little it has to offer. There are other levels in Halo 2 which suffer similarly. High Charity and the Oracle spring to mind immediately, but neither manage to quite emulate the intense monotony of Sacred Icon. Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls and Spartans. If you had a flood-tacular time, do consider liking, subscribing and sharing your thoughts, and fingers crossed we'll meet again soon.